Our group investigated how different variables affect the amount of babies per woman internationally. We analyzed four major components linked to birth rates: education, economy, nutrition, and urbanization. Together, the patterns between these variables help to explain why different regions have different amounts of babies per year. Firstly, we looked at how literacy in adult women relates to fertility. There is a strong correlation between the two, such that a country with a higher literacy rate has a lower fertility rate. Literacy rates are typically an indicator of how educated a country is, so the longer that women are in school, and the more educated they are, the fewer babies each woman has. 3 African countries, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Kenya, show that fertility rate is directly related to how many years of school a woman completes. This may simply be because childbearing is delayed if a girl is in school longer, even more so if she seeks a career after completing her education. The opportunity cost of bearing a child is much greater for an educated woman. Also, more educated women may be exposed to different ideas of family and have more bargaining power in their home. Finally, more educated women know more about childcare and health and would have a higher confidence of child survival and less pressure to bear a child sooner. Statistics show that extending education 1 year by lowering school fees meant a significant drop in fertility. Thus, governments can affect their fertility rate, which ultimately means more resources per child and better health for mother and baby, by cutting costs of schooling in developing countries. Another relationship that we explored is the correlation between babies per mother and GDP per capita. There is a negative correlation between these variables, as we see wealthier, developed countries have fewer babies per mother than third world developing countries. One fundamental economic explanation is that people in developed countries have higher opportunity costs for having children. Another explanation is that as the GDP per capita rises, so does employment rate, which results in lower fertility rates. An example of this correlation is in India's economic growth. Strong data for economic growth for India begins in the 1960s and shows that India had 181 GDP per capita, making it one of the poorest countries at the time. As India's economy begins to grow, we see a massive decrease from 5.86 babies per woman to 2.56 babies per woman. This stark decrease in babies per woman resulted from a higher employment rate, which produced a higher opportunity cost of having children. As we see developed countries with lower birth rates and high GDP per capita, with higher GDP per capita, there is higher employment and distribution of wealth, resulting in high opportunity costs for having children. Conversely, the poorest countries in the world have the highest fertility rates, with poor distribution of wealth and low employment. Thus, we can state that there is a negative correlation between babies per woman and GDP per capita. Another relationship we analyzed was the impact of food security and nutrition on babies per woman. Firstly, we found a negative correlation between food supply per person per day and babies per woman. We found certain regions clustered around similar amounts of babies per woman, with African countries having the highest number of babies and least amount of food. Asian and American countries in the middle, and European countries in the United States with the lowest number of babies and greatest amount of food. Food supply is almost always directly related to wealth, as wealthier countries can afford to produce or import more food, which explains this trend. While correlation does not prove causation, there is a clear relationship between food supply and birth rate. Additionally, we considered the relationship between women's health and the number of children women have. We used the body mass index as an indicator of general health, and found the correlation women's BMIs and babies per woman was also negative. This can be interpreted as the greater a woman's size, the less children she is likely to have. This correlation is loosely linear with a few outlying Asian countries, likely due to the policy restrictions they have on children. For example, China had a one-child policy in place beginning in 1979, which is now a two-child policy, and explains why China and several other Asian countries have maintained consistently low birth rates. This, in conjunction with the lower BMIs that most Asian countries have maintained, results in an interesting distinction from the rest of the world. Most other countries are generally within the linear negative correlation, which may be explained by assuming that women with higher BMIs have access to more food, and countries with access to more food are often wealthier. We also researched the effect of urbanization on babies per woman. There's a negative correlation between urban population share and babies per woman. More rural populations mean a higher likelihood of having a large number of babies per woman. It's important to note that African countries have a high number of babies per woman, but a generally low percentage of urban population. Also, there's a strong positive correlation between urban population annual growth and babies per woman. African countries have remarkably high urban growth rates compared to the rest of the world, as they have a steeper development curve which results in rapid urbanization as people move to find jobs. African countries have significantly higher rates of child deaths, and so to repopulate, have higher rates of babies per woman. Currently, as predominantly rural populations, African countries struggle to combat diseases as the population have poor preventative health care and treatment for ongoing diseases. Urban environments have better access to health and nutrition supplies. However, African populations have high urban population growth rates, and as African populations continue to migrate to urban areas, access to proper nutrition and health supplies will increase. This may become concerning if mortality rates decrease but babies per woman rates remain constant, because the region would experience a rapid population growth in a relatively short time. However, if African countries follow the worldwide trend of a decrease in infant mortality along with a decrease in babies per woman, the population should remain relatively stable. Clearly, these factors are all interrelated and can influence one another, so no one can completely explain why women have the amount of children they do, but the correlations between certain factors can help us to understand these relationships.